from the New Revised Standard Version, which might be different from what is up there. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they had conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. I'm going to begin with some preliminary comments. Chapter 12 is the beginning of a new section in the book of Revelation, a section that goes from chapter 12 to chapter 14. It also serves as the center of the book, the hinge on which the entire Revelation turns, the core of the pictorial argument. Secondly, we aren't meant to read the chapter chronologically. In fact, we're not meant to read the book of Revelation chronologically. The question for the book of Revelation is not what happens next. It's what does John see next. And what John sees is very fluid. It's always going back and forth in time. So the vision that we see before us flashes back to Jesus' birth, flashes forward to his second coming. The images are fluid. The characters come and go before our eyes. Scenes change in an instant. And then third, in these chapters are some of the most vivid, beautiful, and fascinating images, in my opinion, in the entire Bible. And the temptation is to explain them. That is, to get all of these odd images into a more rational form. New Testament scholar Eugene Boring writes, "Revelation's images are not mere illustrations of something that can be said more directly. A picture makes its own statement, its own text. It does not communicate what it has to say by being reduced to discursive propositional language. Just as is the case in visiting an art gallery, while commenting and explanation may help one to get the picture, language about the picture can never replace the message communicated in and through the picture itself." And so Revelation 12 is meant to be read and heard and imagined, not explained. But with all that being said, I do have a sermon I have to preach, and so I have to at least make some attempt to provide some insight into what I think is going on in this text. And so I'm going to offer some comments that might help us to sort of get it, but my words aren't meant to substitute the images that we have before us. So not far from the island of Patmos, where John was imprisoned, was the island of Delos. Delos was sacred to the Greeks because it was the birthplace of the Greek god Apollo. Apollo was the son of Zeus. Apollo's mother, Leto, had fled to the island of Delos to escape the dragon Python, who wanted to kill the baby Apollo. Python fails, and later a grown Apollo will battle with and kill this ancient serpent. The themes of this story can be found in many cultural anthropologies and mythologies of the ancient Near East. It's a variation of the story of how the forces of darkness, chaos, death rebelled against the ruler of light, order, and life, and attempt to overthrow the ruler by killing the divine son, and so to establish a kingdom of darkness. The Roman emperors used this myth for political advantage. Caesar Augustus portrayed himself as the new Apollo, and Caesar Nero made statues to himself as Apollo, the son of God. John takes this myth and reframes it, giving new identities to the characters and giving it, I think, a uniquely Jewish flavor. So what does John see? He sees a woman who is dazzling, radiant, brilliant, beautiful, perhaps an echo of Song of Songs 6, verse 10. Who is this that comes forth like the dawn, who looks as fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? Well, almost from the moment the book of Revelation began circulating among the churches, Christians began identifying this woman as Mary, the mother of Jesus. And there's good reason for this, because this is a woman who's in labor, and she gives birth to a son. But the image doesn't allow us to settle on one meaning, because this woman is also Israel. She's crowned with 12 stars, clothed with the sun, standing on the moon. And those of us who listen with Old Testament ears can't help but hear the dream of Joseph when he has that dream of all the stars and the moon and the sun bowing down before him. And of course, Abraham and Sarah, who's barren and so has no hope for a future, are blessed by God with a child that allows their future to open up. A story about God creating possibility out of impossibility, creating a future where there is no hope for a future. And of course, it is Israel who in the end gives birth to the Messiah. But the messianic birth for Israel is more than just the birth of a child. There's also imagery in the Old Testament of Israel giving birth to a new reality, free from oppression and exile. In the Greek translation of Isaiah 26, for example, we read, "And as a woman in labor comes close to her delivery and cries out in her pain, so have we been. We have conceived, O Lord, because of your fear, and have been in pain, and have delivered the breath of your salvation, which we have worked out upon the earth." And in Micah, "Writhe and groan, O daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go forth from the city and camp in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hands of your enemies." So the image of this woman is Mary, the mother of Jesus. The image of this woman is Israel giving birth to the Messiah, but also Israel giving birth to a new reality of freedom and liberty out of exile. The woman is also the church, giving birth to a new humanity created in Jesus Christ. And of course, she's also the woman, Eve, the mother of all the living, the one destined to give birth to the one who is in conflict with the serpent, but who will finally crush his head. Perhaps the woman is creation itself, groaning in childbirth, drawing near to the birth of the new creation. All of these images are wrapped up in this one. But before we can decide, the image is gone, and another sign appears in the heavens, a dragon. The dragon is red, associated with war and with blood. The dragon is a mythological representation of the forces of chaos and disorder. It's the great sea monster. We've met this monster before in the Old Testament. He is Leviathan and Behemoth. In Israel's faith and imagination, these creatures are manifested historically in the nations that oppressed Israel: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and now Rome. For example, in Psalm 74, we read about Egypt, "Yet God, my king, is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might and broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." This dragon has 7 heads, 10 crowns, 7 diadems, or 10 horns, 7 diadems, or crowns. And 7, of course, in Revelation means completion or perfection. This creature, this dragon, has complete authority, complete power. He's impossible to defeat or to resist. He sweeps 1/3 of the stars to the earth, an allusion to the vision in Daniel chapter 10, where the goat grows a horn that throws down some of the stars and tramples on them. This image of an enemy persecuting the people of God is meant to be the Syrian king, Antiochus Epiphanes. But John reframes it to be a much more cosmic enemy. An enemy who he names Satan, the ancient serpent, going back to the beginning of history again, where Eve is told that there would be enmity, war, strife between her and the serpent. All of these images flow together. But again, before we can decide, before we can settle, the image is replaced by an unfolding drama. The dragon stands before the woman, who is weak, vulnerable in the midst of her childbearing, a woman whose life is in jeopardy, and she gives birth. We're witnessing the Christmas story, but in mythological terms. This story must be read along the nativity stories in the Gospels. Too often the Christmas story is romanticized and tamed, but it's important to remember that there's more going on at Christmas than simply the birth of a cute little baby in a manger. Eugene Peterson writes, "It is John's spirit-appointed task to supplement the work of Matthew and Luke, so that the nativity cannot be sentimentalized into coziness, not domesticated into worldliness. This is not the nativity scene we grew up with, but it is the nativity scene story all the same. Jesus' birth excites more than wonder. It excites evil." And it's also a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, not to read Revelation chronologically. We're not witnessing the future here. We're seeing the past. And so the woman gives birth to a son who will rule the nations, an allusion to Psalm 2. Incidentally, the most often quoted text in the entire New Testament is Psalm 2. The child is snatched from the jaws of the dragon and taken up to heaven. A brief and very odd summary of the birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. A story John's readers would have been very familiar with. Thwarted, the dragon turns its rage against the woman, but it is foiled again as the woman is given shelter and nourishment in the wilderness, just as Israel was in its flight from Egyptian slavery. Judaism developed the idea that the Messiah would gather all of the people in the wilderness, and this image in Revelation reflects that view. The wilderness is a sacred space. It's more than a place where one encounters God. The wilderness is the place where one is provided for, protected, and nourished by God. The woman remains there for 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, or 42 months, a symbolic number. I don't know what it means. But again, before we can start to reflect on all of this, the scene changes again. We go from earth to heaven, where there's war, conflict. Not a literal war, I don't think. The meaning of Satan, deceiver, accuser, could mean a kind of court case, where the devil is thrown out for using poor tactics. And there's also no time frame given. So I don't see this text as an explanation for the fall of Satan, since the book of Revelation isn't really interested in those kinds of explanations. What matters is that the dragon is defeated, and And that defeat is accomplished by the death and resurrection of Jesus. The words thrown down are repeated 5 times. The literal translation is bounced. John emphasizes the utter defeat and humiliation of the drama, of the dragon. And the same drama is retold now, but with poetry, as if prose isn't capable of capturing the power of the dramatic narrative that John is witnessing. It begins with the declaration that we've been hearing over and over in the book. God has won. The kingdom of God has arrived. But before we can celebrate, the scene shifts once again, and we're back on earth. The child of the woman has conquered the dragon by his death and is now exalted to God's throne. The woman, the people of God, the mother of the Messiah and the Messianic community, the church, remain on earth. The dragon, who is now filled with rage, begins its powerful pursuit of the woman in an attempt to destroy her. And the woman is once again brought into the wilderness, for the woman is protected and safe. All right, let me offer up some tentative conclusions. It seems we barely scratched the surface. But they're tentative because we're only at the beginning of this section. And also because, again, these are images and metaphor and language that is very unfamiliar to us. So first, we must always keep before us the consideration that the book of Revelation was written as a pastoral response to the persecution faced by the followers of Jesus at the end of the first century. It's important that we don't allow our speculative interpretations about the possible meanings of this text eclipse its pastoral message. The primary pastoral questions that the text seeks to address, in my opinion, are quite similar to the questions posed by much of the Old Testament. Where is God in the midst of our suffering? And is faith in this God even worth it? Revelation, and this is number 2, offers an answer to these questions by opening us up to the reality that all of our suffering, all of the injustices of the world, all of the pain, the death, the hurt, the besetting sin, all of these are the historical manifestation of a cosmic conflict between God and the forces of darkness and chaos that has been going on behind the scenes since the original disobedience of the first humans. Eugene Boring writes, by identifying the dragon with Satan, the devil, the ancient serpent, John shows that he intends to symbolize all the anti-God forces from Eden on, whatever they may be called. This is what Paul means when he says in Ephesians that our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And this is perhaps one reason why Jesus commands us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. To retaliate against those who oppose us and oppress us is to attack the wrong target and only maintains the very conflict that we're struggling to overcome. In other words, Revelation reveals that there's more going on behind the scenes that meets the eye. Third, there are 2 responses to this, I think, that must be avoided. The first is the very human attempt to avoid responsibility for our actions by blaming them on the devil, or on society, or on culture. And all of these can at times be manifestations of the dragon. As we've seen throughout the book of Revelation, heaven and earth are intimately connected, interwoven with each other. It's not so easy to separate them out. The conflict is certainly out there, but it's also rooted deep in our own hearts. I find it very interesting that in all of the mythologies of the ancient Near East that I'm familiar with, it's the forces in heaven and the actions and activities of the characters of the heavens that have influence on the earth, that are reflected in events on the earth. As far as I know, Judaism, and by extension Christianity, is the only tradition where historical events on earth reverberate in heaven. The beginning of this cosmic conflict was not in some primeval battle in the heavens, some fall before the fall. The conflict began with what I believe to have been an historical act of human disobedience that has cosmic consequences. The second response is to hold to a kind of dualism that presumes that both sides of the conflict are equally powerful, that the conflict is a kind of never-ending battle between good and evil, in which neither side can ever accomplish a final victory. This also is not true. 3 times in our text, the dragon attempts to defeat God and fails to win each time. In the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the dragon and its forces are decisively defeated. This also is an act that happened on earth in history, yet has had and continues to have cosmic consequences. The message of the gospel has, from the beginning, been the announcement that in Christ, God has defeated the forces that have stood against God since the beginning. This message is prophetically and beautifully expressed in this text from Isaiah 52, a text that we'll return to in a few weeks. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy. For in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together in singing, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. And finally, the defeat of the dragon leads to its enraged attack against the followers of the Lamb on the earth. As we saw earlier in our series, the closer Jesus comes, the greater the resistance from the forces that are opposed to him. The persecution of the followers of Jesus by the Roman Empire in the first century is presented in our text as the dragon making war on the children of the woman who is beyond his reach. Christians are still being persecuted today. In fact, they are still the most persecuted religious group in the world. But as I constantly try to remind us, the conflict isn't just out there against us. Christians are really good at persecuting others and ourselves, as can be seen in virtually every social media's platform's comment section. Perhaps one manifestation of the filth the dragon spews out of his mouth. But these are only the death throes of the dragon who has been defeated. And just as the source of the conflict and the defeat of the dragon were historical events with cosmic consequences, so our continuing victory over the dragon is a cooperation between heaven and earth. We overcome the dragon by the blood of the Lamb, who forgives us, renews and restores us, and empowers us to continue in the struggle. And we overcome by the word of our testimony, a word of love and joy, peace and forgiveness, compassion and grace, words that are so desperately needed in our conflict-ridden world. 2 weeks ago, Elise McIver attended a concert in Edmonton, Canada with a girlfriend. As the chords of one of the songs reverberated through the arena, Elise was overcome with emotion. She turned to her friend and kissed her. They were almost immediately interrupted by an usher who told them that they were expressing inappropriate sexual behavior, despite the fact that other couples, straight couples, were kissing all over the stadium. And not to mention that most sporting events in Canada and America include the infamous kiss cam, where the camera focuses on couples kissing and broadcasts it onto the large stadium screen. McIver posted the event on her Facebook page, and the reaction wasn't surprising. Violent, angry, vitriolic responses poured in, demanding that the usher be fired. McIver had a much different response. With the free concert and dinner tickets she received from the stadium as an apology, she invited the usher to join her. She said, then I can get to know her as a person. She can get to know me as a person. And hopefully we can both move forward. With everything in the news right now, we need more love and more hope. And the dragon is defeated again. I conclude with these words from Desmond Tutu. Goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate. Light is stronger than darkness. Life is stronger than death. Victory is ours through him who loved us. Amen.
Amen.
Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for your word.